Hi, it's Conor Svensson here, founder and CEO at Web3 Labs. This is a conversation I had with David Amor, CEO of Playmint. David's a veteran of the video games industry whose career has spanned multiple generations of gaming innovations, including computer, console, free-to-play mobile, and now Web3. In our discussion, we cover what gaming looks like in the context of Web3 and some of the key opportunities it can provide to gaming ecosystems. We also discuss Playmint's first title, The Crypt, a dungeon looting game which made use of the Loot NFT artefacts, which provides an interesting perspective on what bottom-up game development could actually look like. Given David's breadth of experience, I found it incredibly eye-opening to learn about what gaming could look like in the context of Web3, and I'm sure you'll feel the same way. Hey David, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here on the podcast.
Thanks for the invite, Connor.
So before we talk about the gaming industry, I wanted to talk with you first about your own personal journey with Web3 and how you first learned about it and got involved with it.
Yeah, okay, probably three phases. The first, like a lot of people, I was interested in Bitcoin. It's sort of magic internet money is interesting to me. I pride myself on being something of a nerd, and I won't pretend I looked at that and saw it as some sort of economic revolution, but it was interesting in a sort of mathematical and cryptographical sense. And so sort of spent some time looking at that. I won't pretend I was smart enough to put a lot of money, invest a lot of money, but it was interesting to me that as an idea. And then I suppose another moment was a friend of mine that was having a lot of success selling artwork as NFTs. And it became clear that there was an audience for that, and it worked. And it was an application that was different. It wasn't a currency. It was now the idea of selling artwork, one of a kind, generative art. And that was a learning process for me to really get my head around that, and the fact that there was so much value there. I mean, selling art and making money from it. And then I suppose the third was just, like everybody, you start going down rabbit holes, start subscribing to podcasts. And I think there was a particular Chris Dixon podcast, Chris Dixon and Naval, that I think painted the bigger picture. So I'd sort of taken snapshots in the form of Bitcoin and Ethereum as currencies, and then my friend who was selling art as NFTs. But then, over the course of a series of podcasts, I suppose I got a better understanding of what Web3 was from a wider point of view, a sort of top-down point of view. So that's my journey over a few years, I suppose. And then really for the last year, I've been running a company called Playmint that looks at how we can apply Web3 technology into games. And so really for the last year, that's what I've been doing all day, every day, whether at work or at home. That sort of fills my every thought. So I've got a lot to say about it.
Yeah, there's so much happening in the space that it is easy to fill all of your time with it and still feel like you're barely treading water and staying above surface with it all.
My wife kicks me under the table now if I start a conversation about it with somebody at dinner. Then I won't stop until someone tells me to stop. To me, it's super interesting, and super lucky to have a job where I get to do this all day, every day with other people, other nerds like me. So yeah, it's as you say, a fun thing to dive into.
Absolutely, and certainly the was that on Tim Ferriss's show, the
That's
Naval Ravikant
exactly that one. Did you hear that?
Yeah, it was really good, and certainly that tokenization of everything narrative is something that I think it's a really good way of framing Web3 and what's possible with it.
Yes, that's right. And I think that a lot of those things haven't happened yet, but I think that when someone can set a course, then it's up to people like me to figure out, okay, well, let's imagine we get here ultimately, then what are the steps that we take in order to get there? So useful as a North Star.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned NFTs in that context as well, because certainly I think regardless of people's opinions on NFTs and all the speculative side of it, there is kind of that argument that they crossed the chasm in the past 12 months or so and entered into mainstream culture. And was that kind of a sort of a key thing there in terms of it gave you that awareness where you felt, hold on a sec, the people are really interested in this stuff, so there probably is a good angle here that ties into games.
Yeah, I think you say NFTs, it means 1,000 things to 1,000 people at the moment. And I think to a lot of people, people are seeing NFTs as artwork over to them overpriced artwork, and I see more of it as something that I can use in a game, but I'm not really thinking about it's like an entity rather than something that gets traded a lot necessarily. It's just a piece of functionality, a piece of code that I can use, or an idea that I can use in games. So I suppose even though we're using NFTs in our game, we don't necessarily put that at the front of our game. So yes, technically it uses that, but we're not really tapping into the NFT market, the NFT craze. It's a functionality piece, really.
And certainly, as someone who has been a gamer at times, but doesn't really know a great deal about the gaming industry as such, whereas you're a veteran of it. What are kind of the key ways in which you see Web3 and gaming converging? Because there's a lot of narratives about all of this, but I think with all of these narratives comes a lot of hand waving and hype and so on. But as someone who's been through the motions for decades, basically, I think no doubt there's a lot of unique perspectives that you're very well qualified to provide on this.
Yeah. I think the way I'd phrase it is that the games industry is good at figuring out how to make use of new technology. So, as you said, I've been doing this for a while, and I remember when graphic processors allowed us to take 2D games and make them 3D, and that was like a interesting moment for the games industry. And then another moment when we figured out we could use the internet so that two players could play against each other across the internet. Great. Or mobile phones came along and we can create games on phones, or a free-to-play business model was another big change. Or if you remember the Nintendo Wii, where we got a very different set of audience playing games. So I think that the games industry looks at technology and figures out what can we do with this technology that we weren't able to do before. What new types of games can we make, or how can we modify existing games? And I suppose that it's not as immediately clear how you can use blockchain in games, and I think there's a educational piece for both people making the games and people playing the games as to why is this interesting, because it's less obvious. I think the first application that I suppose is fairly obvious is if you take a game like Fortnite, where the game is given away for free and the game monetizes by selling in-app purchases within the game. And that's a very proven business model. I suppose most games that get built these days use that business model. But when you buy something in Fortnite, then it really sits within the game. So it sits on centralized servers controlled by the person that makes the game. So even though your Fortnite character has value because you've played with it a lot, won battles, or bought things for it, you don't have the ability to sell it. But I think that's the wrong version of ownership, and that that's the sort of greater Web3 point, that ownership, if you buy digital items, then you ought to be able to do with them whatever you want. So instead, the idea of holding those assets rather than holding them within the game, they're held outside of the game, which doesn't seem that big a change at first. It's just the game looks at what's in your wallet rather than it looks at what's in your internal server. But if you own that asset outside the game, then you're free to do with it whatever you want, which first of all seems fair, but also it means that conceivably you could sell it at a profit. Well, you might sell that item in order, well, I've just finished playing Fortnite and therefore I'm just happy to sell those things that I've got. That feels right anyway. But the idea that you can play a game, and if you do something well, then you stand to earn from it, is a brand new idea. That's in the history of video games, there's probably no examples of games where it's possible to make money from playing a game. Now, the analogy I would give is something like YouTube, where if you're a YouTube content creator, Google have created a business model where you have a share in the ad revenue. And there you have a sort of symbiotic relationship between consumers like me of YouTube that are thrilled that content creators are incentivized to create videos that I love watching. So it's a sort of, well, it works for all three parties. It works for YouTube, who see 50% of that revenue. Works for me as a consumer in form of ad views. I'm paying to be entertained in exchange for ad views. And it works for content creators because some of them are making pocket money, some of them are making a living from creating content that they might be doing anyway as a hobby. So I think that now there's this idea that, okay, you can potentially earn money from playing a game. So therefore, what is the relationship between players that are spending money in the game and players that are making the money in the game? And indeed, what's the relationship with the company that made the game? So it's a seemingly quite a small change, holding assets outside of the game in a wallet, but it actually has quite a lot of interesting knock-on effects. So I suppose that's the first and more obvious use of blockchain in games.
Yeah, and I think as well, as you say about the play to earn angle, that's absolutely critical there, because I guess somewhat naively, the things that people discuss more are this whole idea of, oh, well, I can buy this virtual good in this game and I can take it to this game, or I can sell it to someone else. And so many people, they ultimately they get into a specific platform and that's really what they care about. Then they're not fussed about being able to take the assets elsewhere. They might want to use a secondary marketplace to get some additional things there, but they're happy in that ecosystem. And so as you say, there's kind of it's where the play to earn angle comes in, because you start to create a much more vibrant economy around the actual the game and the platform there, and more people coming in. And I guess I have this when you said that, these visions of, like with real world goods, when people have a fad or a hobby that they're really into, if you can actually offload these assets when you're done with it, or you're bored of it, or whatever else you want to move on, then that sort of technology does enable that side of it.
Yeah, and it hasn't been possible. I mean, it's been technically difficult, and companies haven't been keen to encourage that. So Epic, who make Fortnite, will ban your account if they see you trying to trade that on eBay. And even if you successfully do that on eBay, it's fraught with fraud and things like that. So the technology makes that process easier, and companies like ours are quite happy with that business model, whereas previously existing Web2 companies would expect to sell items only as primary sales, and there's no concept of secondary sales. I'm saying, sure, I'll sell some items in primary sales, but also I'm happy to take a cut of secondary sales when those assets are sold from one player to another. I also think, and I think a likely outcome is that this monetary aspect will amplify behavior somehow. And I think it's just as it sort of amplified the behavior of content creators on YouTube. I think that you can probably do something similar in games. And it's up to people like the game designers in our company to figure out, how do we amplify the behavior that we want to see? How can we use tokens in game? How can we motivate people to do things that make a better game? And I think that's a creative game design challenge. Let's if people just show up and figure out the best way just to take all the money out of the game, then that doesn't make for a very compelling game experience for everybody playing. But there's certainly possible to build a game that is better for people being motivated to do the things that we're looking for people to do in game.
And then that idea, as you say, about being able to amplify the behavior, is it fair to say that the exact mechanic or mechanism that does that is to be confirmed, but it's more that you'll likely reach this point where someone figures out this sweet spot, and then all of a sudden, it draws a lot more people into that mechanical behavior?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it probably depends on the game. One thing I would say, that where we are as a place in time, so free to play, the idea that free to play business model on mobile phone games was the last big change, I suppose, in the games industry. And I joined that part of the industry maybe 2 years, post Candy Crush, let's say. And a good thing there was I could point to Candy Crush and say that's how you monetize a mobile free-to-play game. That's what works. Because it's making $3 million a day and it has 10 million people playing it. Very easy to point to that, and that becomes the playbook. Where we are as a point in time on Web3 games is those games haven't been created yet. I don't think there's a genre-defining Web3 game yet, which is both a blessing and a curse. For it's a blessing because there's an opportunity for companies like mine to actually be the genre-defining game, but it's a curse because there's nothing to copy, or we're really trying to figure out things from first principles. So I think that's the play and earn, play to earn idea is one. There are other ideas that are sort of bubbling under that I think are interesting, which are things like interoperability. So I think you mentioned that a moment ago, the idea that because assets are held outside the game by the player, then there's nothing stopping another game maker saying, I notice you've got those items in your wallet, you can use those in our game. And in fact, that's what we've done for our first game. We've taken somebody else's game assets and used them in our game. And this isn't anything that, and we didn't have to ask that company because, well, it wasn't technically a company, but we didn't have to ask permission because those assets are owned by the player, not by the game maker. So we can just say, I see you've got those, you're welcome to use them in ours. And then you can imagine that what comes out of our games, the NFTs that come out of our games, can be used in somebody else's games. So you have this sort of tapestry of games that all interoperate with each other. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that a gun in Call of Duty can be used in Fortnite. I think it's probably not that literal. I think it's probably more, hey, I've noticed that in this game you've mined gold. Well, you can use gold in our game to I don't know, pay the mayor of the city to build a bigger city. But there's sort of motivation to play a series of games. And also it's something of a marketing opportunity, because if I can say let's imagine today that Fortnite had NFTs, and then I could build a game that use those NFTs, then I can start to win over players of that game. So again, it's sort of early days on that idea, but certainly technically possible and seems to be working in our first game. I guess the third thing I'd touch on would be composability, which is, well, as I see it in Web3, I think it's the idea that we can encourage people to build on top of our code base. So rather than just interoperating in an asset level, where a game item can be used in more than one game, we're actually sort of combining the code. The code is connecting from one game to another. So what I do in this game affects this game, or I can create a base layer, a layer of game that we allow other people to build on top of. And this is, going back to my point that the games industry is good at finding uses for new technologies. I think it's very early days particularly on this composability point, but very interesting, the idea that create a base layer that you allow other people to build on top of. And the games industry has a rich history of modifying existing games. Very popular games like League of Legends or Counter-Strike came from modifying existing code bases, but there wasn't really an infrastructure for handling that, neither from a technical point of view or from a monetization point of view. But Web3 allows you to plan for that and build for that and even incentivize that. So I could, in my next game, encourage community efforts to build things that make a bigger game. So build bolt-ons to my game that actually improve the game experience for anybody that's playing it. So that's a third new idea of how Web3 ideas can be applied to the games industry.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear, and digging a little bit deeper into those around just like interop. Of course, there's a lot of discussions in the broader Web3 ecosystem about interoperability between different blockchain platforms, and there's an expectation that will be a solved problem at some point. There are solutions in place right now, but then you have these high-profile hacks and so on that take place, which drain funds and so on, which create challenges there. So I guess if we're moving up the stack from there and we're talking about interoperability between games, it kind of ties into this notion of having a sort of common platform between them. Now, with my somewhat limited knowledge, I know you have the Unity game engine, and that's quite a widely used platform that's kind of behind the scenes. And please correct me here because I'm but from what I understand, it's a platform for publishing games on, but you can run it on multiple underlying platforms, and
yeah. I mean, I think that's broadly right. I see, and we build in Unity. You're right. I suppose about half, maybe 2/3 of games are built with using Unity. I think a simple way of imagining what we're doing is using Unity to create the great game experience that you see running on your desktop or on your mobile phone, but instead of connecting to an AWS or Google server, we're in fact connecting to the Ethereum blockchain. So we're still using those tools that we as sort of game makers understand how to make the most of, but by using by using specifically Ethereum or scaling solutions on Ethereum, then we're able to take advantage of Web3.
And so that's kind of because one of the questions I was going to ask about is how can you ensure that you have almost a gamer first type experience when plugging into Web3 technology, as opposed to like a Web3 first experience, which there's a huge difference. And I think that most gamers probably aren't going to be attracted to the Web3 first one, going by what we have out there.
Yeah, no, there's certainly UI, UX. I mean, it's horrific. When I first started to get my head around MetaMask wallets and gas fees and the lag in terms of using it, there's horrible UX problems. But I think that's, I'll flip that on its head and say that's why it's an opportunity for companies like ours. This won't be the case in 3 years' time. These problems will be solved in one way or another. And so the question becomes, well, who are the companies that solve it, and how they solve it? So for me, I like the idea that the UX is currently terrible, because that's an opportunity. The moment where it's fixed, there's less opportunity for companies like mine, I suppose is a way of phrasing it. So we spend a lot of time figuring out how best to use either building technology of our own or using third-party technology to take away some of the pain points so that we can widen up the audience to not just crypto enthusiasts, as is mostly the case now, but to gamers more generally. And there's a secondary point on that, which is that certainly if you think of a traditional gamer, then I think there's a lot of cynicism around, there is a lot of cynicism around how blockchain is going to be used. And I think there's some great things happening, and there's also undesirable things happening in the form of scams, or, if it becomes very predatory, the monetization methods used in games using Web3, then that's a step backwards, I would suggest, for games long term. And so today there's a bit of cynicism that blockchain is going to be used to make games worse. And I think it's up to companies like mine to prove, no, there's a set of things. I think done right, and it's a net benefit for players. The idea that I can own those Fortnite items outside the game and sell them feels like a good thing for players. But I think it's up to companies like mine to demonstrate that that's how this technology is going to be used.
And so to unpack a bit further what you outlined in terms of having this very common game engine, Unity, which many games are built on top of, and then these Web3 backends. How are there still kind of these centralization risks there? Because if the majority of these games are still being developed on the same platform, regardless of if Web3 is in the picture or not, there's still in effect and I don't know if Unity is controlled by a single entity or how it's structured there, but is there risk associated with that? Because of course, if we're thinking about the more sort of utilitarian Web3 view, it's like everything's open source. We've got this nice kind of open source game engine that no one entity controls and so on. But always the reality is that it's customer led, all of this stuff, and the vast majority of people, what they want is a smooth UX experience, right? They don't care about if there's a bit more centralization risk if this stuff works. And so I'm interested to unpack in a bit more detail kind of how it could play out really there, because there's we see it with the crypto exchanges, for instance, that you've got these islands of centralization, and with Web3 there are still risks that you could get quite concentrated centralization, and I'm sure it extends to gaming.
Yeah, good question. I think there's a lot of discussion about chains. So I mean, I think Ethereum is, we call it the chain of truth here. I mean,
Yeah.
love Bitcoin, but it's less adaptable than Ethereum. So that's our sort of. So, and I've actually noticed in the last year that chains are sort of gravitating to that ecosystem. So there's plenty of, I say plenty, there's like a dozen game-specific chains being built, and game makers being encouraged to build on that chain. I think a lot of the motivation is how quickly you can use that chain. What's the response time, but also what the gas price is. So for our first game, whenever you wanted to make a transaction, and we built the game knowing that this was the case, there was only one transaction in our game, but even then, that transaction was $20, and that's not a mass market proposition. So then you have different solutions for fixing that. One is to use a side chain, and there's side chains like Polygon that are far less. So when we moved to Polygon as a test, we found that our gas fee was 5 cents, not $20. So great, that's fixed. But as you say, where's the compromise? And I like thinking, the fact that Ethereum gas prices are $20 in a way is to be celebrated. It's a triumph for decentralization. I mean, it's a painful cost. There's a reason why it costs $20, and equally, there's a reason why it costs 5 cents. And I'm not the CTO of the company, but I think that you are trading off decentralization in exchange for lower gas fees, and I think that is a risk. So I think that it's still emergent what will be the right solution for that. What we like as a technical solution is still using Ethereum, but then using ZK Rollup as a technical solution. So having the security of Ethereum, but still having the scalability in layer 2 of layer 3 of ZK Rollups. We're currently using StarkNet as a solution for that. Although, there's some pain there because Starkware would be the first to admit that that's still alpha software or alpha blockchain. But it does, that feels like a good scaling solution. And of course, Starkware aren't the only people doing ZK rollup. So I think there's ways of keeping decentralization and not corporately owned chains, while still being able to deal with the scaling problem that we see in 2022 right now.
But if we talk about though, then moving up just into the game engines as well, and you say if say the first, you have these assets that live on chain that are associated with games, and then you want to open up support for them in some other game, then is it likely that you're going to end up with almost a closed ecosystem on, say, Unity, because that's where most people are developing, and it's going to be a lot easier to transfer assets via a chain to other Unity games? Or did you kind of envisage that it's more a formality of these different game engines potentially having plumbing behind the scenes that can support these different ledgers, and then it's just down to, say, a studio who's working with a specific engine, they just then will sort of will be able to plug in because it's still Web3 behind the scenes?
Yeah, that's right. So I think important to separate out the client from the server. So the server, I think it's super important that it's decentralized and uses EVM or something that uses that infrastructure. I think what the client's built on is not particularly important. So it could be built using Unreal, could be used Unity, could be just a web interface, could be could be a number of things. And I don't think that's the important part of a blockchain game, how it's represented, almost like the interface layer.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm seeing in this part of the games industry, in the blockchain part of the games industry, I would say 95% of games so far have been what I call Web 2.5. And by that, what I mean is take a Web 2 game, whether that's Candy Crush or whether that's Fortnite or Call of Duty, and adapt that to have tokens or NFTs, and keeping those NFTs on chain. So I think that's an obvious first use, and I think there'll be some successful examples of Web 2 games that keep their assets on chain. And that's what I would define as Web 2.5. Not an industry definition, but to describe what it is. I think there's the next level, which I would call Web 3, which is to keep your game logic on chain. And I think that's much harder. But to actually say that the computation of the game state is kept on chain is possible. That's what we've done in our first game and doing for our second game, and open some more doors because people are free to create whatever interface they like to that game. We could build a web interface for our game, but somebody could then decide that they want to build a mobile interface, because the actual brains of the game are happening on chain, and the client just becomes the interface to the game that's actually running on chain. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's certainly in the, we've seen it in multiple industries. What you framed the Web 2.5, where you have in effect a centralized gatekeeper for a sitting in front of a decentralized platform, be it these exchanges or NFT, many of the sellers of NFTs and so on. And I think part of that too is because we have people almost need to be brought up, have a base level of understanding about the technology as well. In the same way that 2 years ago, you probably couldn't say that most people wouldn't have know what an NFT is. Now a lot of people do, and there's a lot of people who probably have a base understanding of Web3 technology as a result of that. But with what you're talking about there with respect to sort of pure Web3 and this game logic living on chain, is it fair to say that that's more kind of aligned with this idea of your traditional centralized application or game service, or in this instance, and it in itself becomes a protocol insofar as you have logic that exists on a decentralized blockchain, and so then the companies producing this, the sort of monetization strategies change slightly insofar as the value moves to those on and off ramps, and it's maintaining the core logic, but it's there in a sort of decentralized place.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I'll start by giving an example, an analogy that I like that maybe describes the advantages of building that game logic on chain. Not my example, somebody gave it to me, but chess, in a sense, at this point in time, is an immutable game. Now, it's not on any blockchain, but nobody's arguing about what the rules of chess are. Nobody's building super chess. At this point in time, chess is chess. So it's immutable, and it's not on chain, but think of it on chain. Now that it's an established set of game rules, then people are free to build whatever they want. You can make a Simpsons chess game. You can make a wooden chessboard and chess pieces, or you can make chess clocks, chess ranking systems, chess leaderboards, chess tournaments, chess.com. The point is that now that the rules are now immutable, nobody's arguing what they are, and they're permanent. Now people are free to build whatever they want around it, and you would say that chess is a richer game because of the infrastructure and immutability of the rule set. So I like the idea of extending that into a game where we're saying these are the game rules, these are the universe's rules, this is how quickly a character can move from A to B, this is how much resources are hidden in the environment. And now the people are free to, within the rules of that game, to build on top of or adjacent to create something that's richer. I think there's, as part of that, to go on your point about monetization, I think there's a lot of work that gets done on tokenomics. So exactly what the flow of tokens are through the game, how quickly, just as Bitcoin releases an amount of Bitcoin every year, what is our stated flow of gold into our game that can be ultimately taken out of the game and monetized. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what the tokenomics are, so that flow is worked out. And again, that's immutable. So we're saying that yes, we're going to put this amount of tokens into the game at this we're releasing them at this period, and this is how you get to take it out of the game. And in the game, if you trade one resource for another, and this is on our second game, then we take a 5% cut of any secondary sale, just as eBay might take 5%. Take more, don't they? But that the idea that and that feels like a way of monetizing while still having this idea of immutability. So the game rules are set. You don't have to ask us what the rules are. You can see them. It's in a smart contract, and then people are free to interface with them how they want. So that, I think it's I won't pretend I'm an expert in this. It's certainly a new idea for the games industry, tokenomics, but certainly I think that's going to be an important part of Web3 games.
I'm interested to understand a little bit more about I guess, the fundamental drivers for that approach, because certainly in the token economic side, we know the play to earn. There's a potential huge opportunity there, and that's kind of a given. And as you say, with things like secondary sales and so on of assets, there's just great opportunities. But in some industries, trust is one of the big reasons for putting something on ledger, because you have intermediaries. You put something on chain, then you can get rid of an intermediary in the process because you have this sort of this place there. With the games industry, is there the same kind of challenges around trust? And to quote your example there about this sort of immutable rules, because I'd imagine that most people, when they use a game, they're kind of happy with it. They like the game. They're not there questioning, wait a second, it's done something I don't agree with here. And so I'd like to understand just a bit more of your thinking on that side, because I think it's more coming from one mindset, which is different to well, not having that perspective on the gaming industry. So I'm interested to understand more on why that's important in gaming.
Yeah, I guess it's not about trust, but this idea of ownership of digital assets that is being challenged by Web3 across the board, I think certainly is true of games as well, where we've ended up culturally in this odd situation where you own something, but you don't really own it. Like if I go and buy a bike from a bike shop, I don't care if the bike shop goes out of business. I can give it to my sister. I can give it to charity, strip it for parts, run it off a cliff. It doesn't matter. That's mine. And yet somehow in the games industry, we've got used to this idea that I own something, but it's under a very specific set of T&Cs that I can use it and own it. So I think that's I love the fact that that's being challenged. It feels fair and it opens up some new ideas. I will also say that it sort of relates to trust, I suppose, in a way that as a game maker now, I can use the infrastructure of Web3. So I don't have to build a marketplace for the digital items of my game because they exist outside the game. If they want to trade them on OpenSea or LooksRare or 1,000 other NFT platforms, trading platforms, then they can. And it's nice that I don't have to build those things, and I don't have to worry about there being. I mean, there are a lot of scams, but fundamentally, the technology underneath it is sound, and so it's great that I can lean on a set of technologies that exist outside the game to handle a set of things that historically would have been up to me to handle, with billing systems and PayPal and connecting up with our game databases. It was all quite messy, whereas I think the Web3 infrastructure means that we can do this in a more reliable, more trustworthy way.
Yeah, and as you say, it comes ultimately down to this idea of tokens are that common abstraction throughout Web3, so it just provides all this flexibility there.
Yeah, that's right.
So thinking about the incumbents of the space and what's going to get them, really doubling down on this technology. As I'm sure they've been doing experiments, and as you say about some of these Web 2.5 things that have been happening, no doubt they are dipping their toes in the water. But at the same time, I'm sure they're looking at the revenues they're generating from their closed ecosystems right now and how substantial they are. That they probably don't feel that much pressure to move across to Web3. Yeah. So, what do you feel will be that inflection point where they really start having to adapt?
Yeah. One way of putting it is that there's the famous Jeff Bezos phrase: "Your margin is my opportunity." Like if you're selling something with a 50% margin, I come along and give 25% margin, I'm going to win your business. Yeah. And similarly, I think games company. I remember a year ago speaking to somebody that runs a successful game studio. We were just having a drink, and I said, and the thing is that the players will be able to trade amongst themselves. He said, "Why on earth would I want that? I'm in the business of selling everything directly myself. That's a perfect business model." And I said to him, "Well, you might not, but I will. I'm setting up a company. I'm going to do that, and I guarantee your players, on the assumption that the game is of comparable quality, I can guarantee you they prefer to play my game where they get to do with their assets whatever they like. And that's my opportunity as a game maker." So I think whether the incumbents are immediately embracing this technology or not. People like me see an opportunity to win business from providing a different opportunity to players, a different setup, if you like. So I think that whether they're looking to change the status quo or not, the status quo is about to change. So there's that aspect. And I would say to people, in the games industry, incumbents in the game industry, I think you can probably make as much money from secondary sales as you can from primary sales if you gear the game up correctly. And that seems, that feels like a good piece of game design to make sure that rather than people just having something and holding something, you encourage players to trade amongst themselves. Then, if you're taking a 10% fee on those secondary sales, and if somebody trades something 10 times, then you're seeing the same amount of income. And also, you could probably say that in a game where people are free to take their money out, their assets out at some point, then they're probably spending more money in the first place. So it's not quite an apples for apples comparison. So that's, I think that's one side of it. And another is that I speak to game companies, I won't name names, but big game companies, top tier games companies, and they say, look, don't tell anybody, but we're building this right now. We're either building tools or we're building infrastructure or we're building games with these ideas in mind. The reason the don't tell anybody part is because there's such a reaction from gamers right now, traditional gamers, that somehow this technology is going to be used in a way they're not going to like. It means that if you're Electronic Arts, for instance, then it's not a good PR move to say, great news, the next FIFA game is going to have NFTs in it. Now, whether their intentions are good or not, their player base is going to have a lot to say about that idea, or at least the vocal part of their player base. So in a way, I think the existing incumbent game companies are going to find it difficult to innovate here in a way that smaller companies, new companies, are not. Plus, you also have innovators' dilemma. EA are busy making FIFA 2023, 2024 rather than worrying about what this new Web3 business model is, etc. So, which is just a common thing when new technology comes along. It's better exploited by new games companies or new companies, full stop, rather than the incumbents generally.
Yeah, and I can certainly imagine how some of the traditional gamers feel about some of the Web3 stuff when you have like terrible UX. You have NFTs that are worth a lot less to them than what they have in game, yet they cost many orders of magnitude more than what they pay for in game currently, and then all the scams with it. So yeah, I can.
Well, and truth be told, like, can you hand on heart say that somewhere up in EA headquarters, the board aren't rubbing their hands and saying, how can we make more money from our players with this new technology? So I'm picking on EA. I have no idea if they are or they're not. But the point is that there's plenty of people using, just as the internet some time ago, people use the internet for good things and bad things, scammy things, wholesome things.
Yeah.
And you can't point to it as being a good thing or a bad thing. It just really depends on the application of it. So yeah, but as you say, there's a reaction from traditional gamers right now, which is that very cynical of how this technology is going to be used in games. And I think it's really, talk is cheap. I think the solution to that is to build games that use it in a positive way. And similarly, we saw something similar in mobile free to play as a business model. Give the game away for free and then allow people to buy things in the game. That wasn't a business model that was well received by traditional gamers until games like League of Legends came along, which is all Fortnite, that just did that in a brilliant way. And now, in and of itself, free to play is not considered a bad thing. It's now a bit more nuanced on that, and traditional gamers will query how it's being used before passing judgment.
Yeah, and I guess in that same vein as you're saying about the secondary marketplaces too, because there's great revenue potential for the publishers, but then also people when they want to offload these things that they no longer have. So it's a win-win situation from that perspective.
When done right, I think it's awesome. I think players are going to love it, but you can't point to many examples today where it's been done well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the other areas that people talk about, and it might be something that's really you're not focusing on at the moment, but there's this whole idea of GameFi where you're kind of converging. There's, as we've spoken about, this Web3 token based models, but there's these opportunities that some talk about with respect to really plugging games into some of the DeFi ecosystem as well. Now, DeFi, of course, is a fast moving, evolving space. Not probably in there's a lot of people who aren't too happy with it given the events of the last few days. But
Yeah.
that aside, more generally, is it something that's kind of on your radar as like an additional aspect to all of this, or is it at this point in time more of a kind of we've got too much other stuff here? It's we'll see how that evolves separately.
Yeah, I'll start by defining what I think a GameFi game is, because I've
Mm.
seen it used in different ways. I suppose
Yeah.
I consider GameFi to be DeFi with a games wrapper. So,
Mm.
um, and yeah, you're right. It's not really something that we're focusing on. I think that Web3 games have been built by two categories of game makers. The first is crypto natives learning games, and the
Mhm.
second is game natives learning crypto, and we're in that latter category. I think that um, you've seen some GameFi games from crypto native people because they really understand the tokenomics behind it in a way that I don't, but perhaps are less proficient at making what you would consider a traditional video game. So we see these sort of quite scrappy looking games with a complex DeFi um, tokenomics behind them. And I think to me that's less interesting. I mean, DeFi for me personally is less interesting. I'm less interested in the speculation aspect of Web3, more interested in what can we do now that we couldn't do before. So I'm not saying that plenty of people have made money making GameFi games or playing GameFi games, but it doesn't feel as sustainable, because if somebody's extracting money out of a GameFi game, then presumably somebody somewhere is that has to be compensated. So I approach that part of the games industry with, let's say, trepidation, if not cynicism. I don't know.
Completely makes sense. And whilst we're on some of the, I guess, emergent themes, it's hard not to ask the question about the metaverse as well.
Mm.
So from my own perspective, we've played around a bit with Oculuses. It feels like there's a long way to go before actually using that sort of device. But I'd love to get your kind of views on this whole metaverse narrative and Web3, because whilst it isn't gaming, it kind of ties in with it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, what on earth is the metaverse? Is it's really hard to talk about, because what if you close your eyes, what you picture might be very different from what I'm picturing, and there's no sort of commonality. Oh, well, there's a bit of commonality in what that is. Um, I think um, I think it's going to be a part of our future, but I sort of maybe not in the next 5 years, or maybe what you see in the next 5 years is a logical extension of products like Roblox and Minecraft and Fortnite, rather than something else. So I think that we're heading that direction. How it plugs in with Web3, and this is more obvious to me. I think digital ownership is completely upended by Web3 in a positive way, at least for the consumer. And I think that ends up being an integral part of the metaverse, whatever the metaverse is. I think digital ownership is an important part of the metaverse, and Web3 is a much better way of handling that, I think. And then there's sort of the tokens that sit behind it. So it would be disappointing to me if the metaverse has the dollar as its universal currency. I think a better solution and a more likely solution would be a sort of cryptocurrency that runs through it, or a series of cryptocurrencies. So I think that the cryptocurrency infrastructure, tokenomics, um, composability, interoperability, digital ownership, all of these things that are part of Web3 today end up being important components of the metaverse, almost in whatever version of metaverse that is. Um, and I think that it's a difficult thing to predict. It may be that I think a lot about the hyperverse versus the metaverse. The hyperverse being sort of the open source collection of community projects rather than the Apple, Google, or Facebook owned version of the metaverse. I'm sort of silently hoping, or not even silently, but I hope what the metaverse is more like the internet in 1995 than the internet in 2020.
Tied in with all of this is the social connectivity side of it, because within different gaming platforms, we've spoken a lot about these them being closed in terms of the assets and so on that reside on them, but they're also closed in terms of your connections with other people on that platform. In terms of, I play this game, I have my friends on this game. There is, say, I know that there is some crossover with some platforms, like on it's again, this is at the limits of my knowledge here, but I think with my Xbox, I can have friends on that. But then some games I play, it's very much so like a closed loop ecosystem on that. So as in, I only have friends, who I'm friends with for that game, but then you have ones that kind of extend beyond that. Do you think that this, this wider adoption of, if you have tokens and assets that can move between games more fluidly, then you'll also start to have the social graphs of connectedness start to get a bit more real as well, and you're less likely to have so many of these closed loops on games where you have a friend who's specific to this one game, because that's just how that game's ecosystem is.
Yeah, well, I really hope so. I mean, it's technically there's no problem of getting an Xbox to talk with a PlayStation. Very easy. They both use TCP/IP. You could figure that out in no time. But still, we can't. A PlayStation game can't play. Oh, with a few exceptions, you can't play Xbox versus PlayStation, and the friends list that you have on an Xbox is different from PlayStation, Android, and Apple. And these closed ecosystems haven't really made great strides in unifying your social graph. And even if they have, then I wouldn't want to rely on those corporate entities to always be operating in the best interests of the consumer. So I'd prefer to see a decentralized social platform. I don't know quite what you call it, but I'd love to see that. Again, it's technically quite, I don't know if it's quite easy, but there's no reason why you couldn't have all of that existing in a decentralized way. And then if your Xbox hardware or your PlayStation hardware or your Android device or Apple device are connecting to this rather than having their own closed system of users. So I certainly hope to see that change, in the same way that instead of game assets sitting inside a game, they actually sit in a player's wallet. That seems a much better way of handling that problem and opens up a new set of possibilities. I think that you've seen a lot of web companies not really working in operating in the best interests of the people playing the game, but I think that would be a good step to solve that. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, it ties in with the hyperverse, as you were saying, I guess.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more just about the first game, the Crypt that you published. Just because for people, well, I'm not too familiar with the mechanics of it, and I'd love just to learn a little bit more about it, because you've said it's fair to say more of a kind of experimental early game, rather than one of many that are there'll be many more to come. But I'd love to learn a little bit more about it and how it was approached compared with how you do a traditional game, because of the Web3 aspect to it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I'll start by saying that when I was making PlayStation games for a long time and then decided that we should be making mobile games, and when I first started to think about what kind of mobile games we made, I made the mistake of trying to take my PlayStation games and squeeze them into a phone, which technically I could do. It's amazing, very powerful piece of technology, a mobile phone, but it just wasn't right for the platform, wasn't right for the audience. And the games that I made, first games I made for mobile, failed because I made some assumptions about what that kind of game should be. And so when we decided that we were going to make Web3 games, then we decided to, rather than just play into our comfort zone of just making the games we used to make but adding some tokens on top, we decided, no, let's do the weird new stuff. What's important in Web3 and how are we going to learn about it? So there's an NFT set called Loot, which is if you don't know what Loot is, it's quite complicated to describe. I'll give it a go, but it's a set of 10,000 NFTs which are to be used in games. And when I first heard about this, so they're to be used in games. Well, so the person's building a game, are they? No, the person who's issued these has no intention of building a game, hopes other people will do that. I thought it was the craziest idea I've ever heard. Nobody ever builds a game by starting with a game asset and then building upwards. You always start the other way around. You say, all right, we're going to make a football game and it will have a football in it at some point. So the idea of starting with a football, so to say, is a really weird, interesting new idea. And over time, you go, well, hang on, we could have this Loot NFT that could be used in a series of games. And so now if somebody owns one of these Loot NFTs, then it can be used in David's game at Playmint or this game or this game. And not only could it be used in a number of places, but these games could interoperate with each other and make a more interesting game by sort of having this Web3 idea that the football could be passed around between games, if I'm extending that analogy a bit. But, that's... I think a really interesting. So we decided that we were going to do something quickly using this Loot NFT because the Loot, as far as I'm aware, was the first example of an interoperable game asset without intentions of actually building it into a game. There's lots of people making blockchain games, but they're not really going out of their way to say, here's our assets for you to use in your game. So the Crypt, as you say, somewhere between. I mean, it's a game, but it's an experimental game. Was one where we took somebody else's game asset, this Loot NFT, and created a dungeon game around the Loot NFT. And players need to join forces with other people that own that Loot NFT to figure out which dungeon to beat, how to approach it, to form into clans, into groups, raiding parties, and sort of cooperate. There's a lot of game that goes on outside the game. And so that was a game that we made just in 3 months. It's quite a simple game, but really taught us some things that we felt were going to be important in Web3 games. So some of them some more philosophical, like interoperability and composability. Some more technical, which is how do you build on-chain games? How do you write in Solidity, which is Ethereum programming language? How do you deal with gas prices? How do you optimize those? And how do we operate properly with OpenSea? And there's a group of things there that we needed to understand in order to make something that looks more like a typical game. So now we're using the learnings in the first chapters, because we've done a series of chapters now with our game, The Crypt, and we're using those to build our second game. So there'll be the two will be connected up together. So the things that you've won in our Crypt game can be used in our next game, if you see what I mean.
And in terms of, so you're working with the Loot NFTs, but then the actual assets or items that people can get from the first game, what do they look like? Do they exist as NFTs themselves, or are there tokens in there?
Yeah, they're the prizes, if you like, for successfully raiding a dungeon are called Relics, and those are our NFT set. So you can't buy them as a primary. We don't sell relics. The only way you can get a relic is to win, beat our game, or to buy them from OpenSea where they show up. And yeah, so like our second chapter use a combination of NFTs. So the first one just used Loot, but then the second one uses Loot and more Loot. I won't go into why they're different. And the third one uses Genesis, Adventurers, and Loot and more Loot. So we have this idea that we're combining NFTs, different NFT sets, in a way that you need to coordinate with other players according to who has those NFTs to then beat our dungeon. And that was chapter 3. And then the NFTs, the relics that players win, can be used in either subsequent chapters of the game, The Crypt, or in our second game, or in other people's game. And we haven't really described a lot about that utility, but I think that the utility of those NFTs gives players motivation to win them. So I talked earlier about amplifying player behavior. If there's a feeling that the thing that I win out of this game is not just about kudos, but it has utility and it has value, then it encourages people to play in a slightly different way, I think. So, trying out those new philosophical ideas, I suppose.
And no doubt you're creating communities off the back of it, because these people are getting NFTs, and it's like, hey, I've got one of these NFTs, and I've played through this far, and you can have all these micro communities that can form beyond just, say, people hanging out on Discord servers. So I'm sure
Yeah,
there's all sorts of things happening there too.
yeah, and from a game design point of view, we deliberately built a game where you can't succeed on your own. You have to collaborate with other players, and that means that the majority of the game sits in Discord servers and chat channels, and there's all sort of double crossing between those raiding parties and secret information, and it's I think that you're right. Community is a large part of it, and something that we can do to really help with that is to create a game where being part of community and working with the community helps you succeed in that game.
And do you think the kind of the loot sort of asset first model is something that could take off?
Yes, um, I think its final form has yet to be shown. I think one of the things that we learned was about permissionlessness. The idea being, sure, we can take the Loot NFT and use it in our game, and now build a game that lives in what's known as the Lootverse. So you could say this collection of games and experiences make up the Lootverse. One of which is great. I didn't have to ask the CEO of Loot Limited. It doesn't exist. I can just use those NFTs. A downside of that, or at least there's something to figure out, is, well, how does the community now figure out what's canon? How do we create consistency in this Lootverse now? How do we make sure that the weapon that you have inflicts 10 damage in your game, but also 10 damage in our game? Because the item as existed as an NFT, it wasn't explicit about that. So there's a task of collaboration between other people building games in this permissionless way, to coordinate in a way that's still decentralized, but finds a way of creating a sort of cohesive universe and cohesive narrative. So there's certainly some challenges around that. And I think that at some level, it's probably, I don't know, the commercial part is a little bit harder to work out. I think if you build top down, then it's easy to sell that game experience and make it easy for people to spend money on. But it's certainly commercially more complicated to say we will use an asset from this bottom up approach, taking an asset that somebody's bought but we've seen no income from. Well, how do we then monetize that as a game maker in a world where we haven't seen any revenue from the primary sale of an NFT? Now, I think it's a solvable problem. Like in our game, the Crypt, if you want to raid the dungeon more than once a day, then you have to spend some money. So it's sort of free to play, but there's the option of spending money, and we, made some amount of money from it. So it's a provable business model, but it requires a bit more thought. I'm very used to, for 20 years, we sold a game by selling a box product at $70, and that was it. And then more recently, we have this free-to-play business model where we give away the game for free and then monetize through in-app purchases. Now, this is a new business model where we're taking assets that we see no primary and we'll see no secondary sales from, and somehow building a game around that still monetizes. So it's there's something of a challenge to figure out what the business model is going to be around that sort of idea.
Yeah, no doubt. It's a great thing for creators, or even if people were rendering all sorts of fantastic beasts or avatars or whatever else, and in theory they could be brought in. But as you say, it's how you kind of join the dots, so that there's you have that bit for providing the platform that the player and the creator are kind of interacting with the game on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think to me that's fun. I like the games industry because it reinvents itself every 5 years with some new piece of technology or new business model. And it's interesting to me to spend my working day figuring out how's this going to work? How do these pieces fit together, both commercially and creatively? So and also, I suppose there's just a business opportunity if we can demonstrably be an expert in figuring this out. By demonstrably, I mean make a game that everybody loves where this all works, then that creates value in our company.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one final point on that. Do you feel like the whole kind of the change with Web3 is more significant than the ones that have gone before, or kind of on a par? Because as you said, there was 2D, 3D, internet, mobile. And these things happening every 5 years. These big innovations. That's probably a lot more than many other industries in terms of your ability to adapt. Because well, I guess people games are such a crucial thing to them. So, yeah, what are your thoughts there?
Um, it's not obvious yet. I mean, I've seen people in the games industry say that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 90% of games will have NFTs in them. It would just
Mm,
be the economy of a game. Now that, maybe it plays in the same way. I think Mario Brothers will always be Mario, right? I don't think, but maybe the way in which the business model that surrounds it might change. And I could see that Web3 would be a part of a lot of games. That's easy to imagine. And I think that I very much hope that the days of giving away content to build value in other people's platform goes away. So I think you post pictures to Instagram, then you get back likes, but Instagram and Meta are the ones that really build value from your digital assets. So I very much hope we see a Web3 change where uh, people own their own digital assets and are able to monetize their own digital assets. And I think that ought to extend it. I would expect that to extend into games. So as to, the games industry is about $200 billion a year internationally. And I would expect that, in 3 years, maybe there's $50 billion from the Web3 games. I'm just plucking a number out the air, but that wouldn't surprise me. Mobile is about 80 to $100 billion of that right now. So that's sort of, I can imagine that. But then, I can imagine that Web3 ideas make it into all types of games. And what does a blockchain game mean? Is a bit like saying, what does an internet game mean? Internet is in 95% of games now, but we don't call them internet games. So I think it just ends up being the infrastructure that sits behind a lot of games, whether that's commercially or technically.
absolutely. Final question, just before we wrap up, I wanted to ask. So, in 10 years' time, how do you think the gaming industry will look?
Oh, predicting the future, that never goes wrong. um, oh, I think that I think that often it's not as radical. I mean, just things don't change as radically as you would imagine. So I think the games will still look and feel like games in some shape or form. I'm not even sure. An obvious answer might be AR, VR, but even that, I'm not. I think people will still be playing games on their phones and playing games on their consoles. I don't think I would expect everybody to be VR, AR. I think for some maybe, um, but I think that the technologies and the way that they're presented and the business models might have changed in games, and the play patterns, that kind of stuff. The play pattern of playing Candy Crush is very different from playing Call of Duty, let's say. But I think games inherently will still be games. It's just they'll be presented and monetized probably in a different way. Um, it's a bit of a non-answer, wasn't it? I don't know. I mean, it would be boring if I did. If really I could say with some degree of certainty that this is what the games industry is going to be like in 10 years' time, so my job just becomes implementing those steps, that doesn't sound like a particularly interesting use of 10 years. So I hope any ideas that I have are wrong and we figure it out along the way.
That's it. That's what keeps it exciting. That constant.
Exactly.
Well, David, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and it's just been really helpful to get so much perspective as well on the gaming industry. Yeah, it's just been very enlightening. If people want to follow you or keep up with what's happening there, are you active on any social media platforms, or is it more about people go to Playmint? What would you recommend?
David Amor, AMOR on LinkedIn is where you'll find me. I sort of Damor, DAMOR underscore ETH is my Twitter, but I'm not great at keeping that up to date, to be honest. But yeah, either of those work. So it's I suppose that's probably the best way.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David, and I look forward to seeing a number of future Web3 games coming along and sort of disrupting the landscape and moving all of these games onto more open platforms with transferable assets.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Thanks for inviting me. Good to speak to you, Conor.
Cheers. Hi, it's Conor Svensson here again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm really excited to share with you that I've written a book, The Blockchain Innovators Handbook, a leader's guide to understanding, adopting and succeeding with this disruptive technology. I've been wanting to share my learnings about blockchain and Web3 for a number of years with a wider audience, and I'm really excited that I can do this now. This book covers everything from the fundamentals of the technology through to opportunity identification and implementation for your business to ensure that you can be one of the big beneficiaries of the wider transition to Web3 that's taking place now. The book is available in physical as well as digital form. For more information, head to web3labs.com/innovators.